This is WPSL Port St. Lucie, the talk of the Treasure Coast.
It's 10:08 at WPSL 1590, the talk of the Treasure Coast, and you're on Ask A Rabbi.
And this is Rabbi Shafir Loeb of Congregation Eitz Chayim, your Jewish home on the Treasure Coast. And Eitz Chayim, for people who don't know, means tree of life. And yeah.
Okay.
We kind of thought that was a great name. So this is as good a time as any because we're coming up on our 8th High Holy Day season celebration, which is amazing. 7 years ago, just over 7 years ago, the congregation was formed. It was formed the beginning of August 7 years ago. I guess that would have been 2015, if I can do my math. And
yeah, I think that's 7.
Yeah. It was...
never been good at high math.
I understand that. And math and addition is certainly way up there. It's amazing how many people can't do it. That's a whole nother discussion. So, yeah, we started, let's go into really old history. Eitz Chayim community was a chavara. Chavara is a group of friends who get together, and we actually started because of something called the Palm Tree Kala, which I brought with me from Tucson. In Tucson, it had been the Cactus Kala. And when we came out here, we wanted something Floridian. And so we renamed it the Palm Tree Kala to indicate that it would be in this part of the world, which is known for having many palm trees. And the group was to support that yearly gathering, which hasn't happened, thank you, COVID. We hope to be getting back to it hopefully next year. I keep hoping. And the world keeps laughing. But anyway...
yeah, and COVID just has done a bunch of weird things.
It really has.
It really has.
And so what the group did, because the yearly gatherings were only once a year, and we wanted more spirituality in our lives, we gathered one Saturday a month for a Havdalah celebration, which is the end of the Sabbath, and we would do singing and drumming and meditating and things like that, along with a potluck dinner. And then on a different week, 2 weeks apart, was a Sunday night with a guest speaker and also a potluck dinner. So, we'd had these two functions once a month. And when situations became what they were, and I was no longer with the other congregation in Port St. Lucie, the steward of blessed memory and a couple of others who were actually meeting that Sunday to decide who the next series of guest speakers would be, looked at me and said, "We don't want you to leave Port St. Lucie, Rabbi. Would you consider actually making this a congregation?" And I said, let's take a week and really look at it and decide if we're ready for that kind of commitment. And obviously we did, and we scurried, and we held that first High Holy Day gathering in tradition. Mm-hmm. In the town square.
Town hall.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And since then, we've just kind of done it. It's been fairly amazing. This year, actually, thanks to COVID, Sharon Loper, our cantor, is not going to be there, so they'll hear her on tape, and they'll have to listen to my questionable singing. But we will have a joyful service, and the reason she can't is because she actually had COVID this year, and it ate up all the time she had to not be at school. She's also a teacher, so she no longer has those personal days.
Yeah,
COVID stole those from her.
Hey, yeah, stole a lot of stuff from a lot of people.
Yeah, it stole life,
including all the kids you teach. I mean, it's this has been just a horrific few years for teens.
Yeah, we're going to, down the road, we're going to talk pre-COVID and post-COVID. It's one of those kind of events. And I have to imagine that in the 1920s, they did the same thing before and after the Spanish flu.
Yeah.
that, we see pictures from the Spanish flu where even the cat is masked, and people were fined for not wearing their masks in an effort to curb that spread. So some things are not new. They just happen over and over again. And that's true. There will always be viruses and illnesses, and there's a song that I frequently play for my students to explain the influence of Aristotle, because Aristotle, while a brilliant philosopher, was also extremely opinionated, sexist, racist, and all those other wonderful things. And he spread that as well.
Well, he's Greek.
Yeah.
Enough said.
Not only was he Greek, but he was privileged Greek.
Yes.
Right? He was raised wealthy enough to be able to study under Plato, which you can't be one of the common folks and study philosophy in those days.
Okay. Well,
in those days, because you would have been working, and who had time to philosophize when you're struggling to feed your family?
The Ivy League of Greek institutions.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. And he gets
the
hired.
Privilege.
And he gets hired to be the teacher/tutor, of course, for Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great expands Greek influence throughout Persia, which is Iran, all the way up and down that famous Silk Road that we've talked about before, and all the way down to Alexandria. He actually creates a library down in Alexandria that later burns. He creates a lighthouse down there to help shipping lanes and things like that. So again, there was some good that was done and some horrible things that were done in the name of progress.
Just imagine creating lighthouses all the way back then.
Yeah. Well, they had to light the midnight oil, as
for
it
ships.
were.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it was costly to have your ship go too close to the shore and get beached and sunk.
Oh, yeah.
That hasn't changed.
That's incredible when you think that many years ago that someone had the foresight to think of that.
Yeah, to put a lighthouse on something so that people didn't end up getting too close to the shore because their navigation was just a little bit off. They didn't have the satellite navigation now that can tell you if you're walking on the right side of the street or the left side of the street.
They had the stars.
They had the stars, but they're not that precise when you come down to, it's a few thousand miles down to the ground, or a little more than that. But so they knew, but and storms and waves and things like that could drift you. And I'm sure that some people were better than others at knowing exactly where they were. But now we have much better navigation systems, and we have much better weather systems. I know that I've said it previous times, but I think that part of the Bermuda Triangle was offshore unseen hurricanes and other storms that just weren't on the radar because people weren't on the radar.
Mm-hmm.
And the storms weren't on the radar. And if you weren't prepared, you flew right into one of these things, it could get briefly exciting. Terrifying, right?
Well, and you, as a pilot, ran into that a lot with some strange storms over the mountains in the Midwest.
Yeah. They didn't. Once upon a time, people didn't believe that the Appalachians could cause what are called mountain waves.
Well, those are foothills.
Yeah, right. Those are foothills.
Well, by California
standards, they are, but they're plenty enough high.
Yes.
And what finally convinced people that the winds are like that, and they're impressive, having been caught in an up and down wash coming across them because we were just low enough to get caught in it, and hoping that we would gain enough altitude before we sank and got over. We were really glad when we got over them. But what convinced people that phenomena actually exists was seeing something called lenticular clouds, which are the smooth wind-sheared clouds they're called lenticular because they look a little bit like a lens, and it's caused by the really high winds. And when people saw that, they went, whoa, okay, the winds do pick up over those mountains.
Yeah, well, and just something as simple, our old helicopter pilot at Channel 39 in San Diego later went on and did tours in Hawaii and stuff at the Grand Canyon of the Pacific. And he was saying you laugh about Hawaii being as humid as it is, but you get in that canyon and you've got the same downdrafts that you have at the big Grand Canyon.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sure.
Yeah, we tend to underestimate the effect of nature. She is not to be messed with.
No.
She's not to be toyed with. So, so those are some of the things that have happened over time and over situations. And, of course, right now we're seeing that new storm, right, that they're saying is going to hit the West Coast and come right across. And as I left the house, my comment to my husband was, we typically, if we're going to get a storm in a year, it seems to come between Rosh Hashanah, which is Monday, and Yom Kippur, which is 10 days later.
Yeah?
That seems to be a really popular time for hurricanes to hit.
Well, that's the peak of the hurricane season.
It's the peak of September is the peak of the hurricane season, and that's usually when Tishrei presents us with Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Tishrei, of course, being the Hebrew month that is a lunar cycle. And so the new year starts on Sunday night. Always starts in the evening because the scripture said it was evening, it was morning, day one. So
now this is not a time to say Happy New Year.
Yeah, you can say Happy New Year.
You can.
I mean, there's nothing wrong. We say a good year, L'Shana Tova, may you have a good year. May you have a sweet year is very popular. And, it's a Happy New Year. Happy Jewish New Year, just like you would say to the Chinese, Happy Chinese New Year. And we don't do fireworks and we don't do wild parties. It's a day spent in reflection and joyous prayer. Rosh Hashanah is the birthday of considered spiritually the birthday of the world, of the universe. So, of course, we don't really know when that was because Fox News, MSNBC, and CNN and all the other media outlets weren't there to record it. Imagine that.
Why not?
Yeah, they should take a time travel machine and go back to before there's a sun, moon, and stars.
And Rupert Murdoch.
All those things. So, it's spiritually the new year. So it's a time of refreshing. We talk about the book of last year being sealed and the page being turned on the new year. And it's a blank page. And in our liturgy, we talk about you are invited to guide the pen that writes your life.
Ooh, I like that.
It's the book of your life. And so the reflection question is, what did you do well last year? What were your oops? And what are you going to do this year to use the knowledge and the wisdom that you hopefully gained from your mistakes last year to hopefully make a few fewer? Yeah. And it's not so much about writing a whole bunch of resolutions and going to the gym. It's about how we treat each other and ourselves. You have to treat yourself well as well. And that's something that people often don't get. But you can't be kinder to others than you are to yourself. And so there's this instruction that comes out of the middle of the book of Leviticus that says, you shall love each person as you love yourself. Right in the middle of the book of Leviticus. Right in the middle of Torah, the first 5 books. Yeah, imagine that. Who do you think might have been quoting that once upon a time? And I'll leave it at that. But that instruction, and it's a two-way instruction. One, it is to love others and not just be a narcissist. Mm-hmm. But it's also be careful and do some self-care. As I like to tell people, it's the same as being told to put the oxygen mask on yourself if they come down and you're on a plane. And that's so that you don't pass out before you do it for somebody else. Mm-hmm. And I know that I was talking recently with somebody and said, when you have an emergency, the first thing you do is call 911. The second thing you do is go help somebody. Because if you go and help somebody first, you haven't put on you haven't made provisions for when you get too tired to continue the CPR, the compresses, whatever it is that you're doing. If there's 2 people, then you can turn to one and say, you call 911 and I'll do this. But if you're alone with somebody, then you need to call 911 first. Get help and reinforcements coming.
Which is why paramedics come in twos.
Right, so that they can spell each other, so
Sure.
that one doesn't.
You bet.
Because it's hard work to do first aid. I've been on a first responder team. I'm not currently current on my training for do that, but I used to do it at Goodyear. I was on the first responder team. And I was actually that we changed. In the beginning, it was make sure you're safe, then go in and respond and send somebody to call 911 was the original set of instructions. And then we realized that when you're first on the scene, there might not be somebody else with you. Call 911 first. Then go in and help. The first thing, obviously, was to make sure that you were safe, because you don't need 2 emergencies instead of 1.
Sure.
And that's important.
Mm-hmm.
And those are judgment calls. Is it safe to go into where there's a fire? And I can remember responding to a fire inside the tech center. It was just actually right outside my office, but up in an area where the machinery went 2 or even 3 stories up, and the fire was up on the very top of it. So it was outside my office, but it was a couple flights up, 1 or 2 flights up. And there were a couple of first responders in our office, and yes, we called the fire. We called Goodyear Fire, and they, of course,
they had their own fire department?
They have their own fire department because
Oh, wow. Okay.
inside the factory there are different firefighting. There's firefighting equipment so that it not reach outside the building.
Oh.
Which they did. They actually suppressed the fire. It was the rubber up on top had gotten too hot, and some dust bunnies, and it's one of the reasons why you got to clean that machinery, folks. And all of that had hit some flashpoint, and nobody was ever really in danger, as long as the fire got put out before it got to anything, anything wooden in the building, because it was confined to the machine, and they had the operator had stopped the machine when he saw it.
So did they use like the suppressant stuff that they have at like airports?
Yeah, they've got a variety. They've got water hoses through and some other stuff. I don't know all the details, but they were responding, and so I and the others went out, and my cohort decided it wasn't safe to go there because something could have fallen, whereas I went to go check and see if there were any humans trapped by the smoke and fire. And was there a danger? Absolutely. How dangerous was it? That was a judgment call. I'm not saying that he was right or I was right. We just had different viewpoints. And that's important too. Because his staying back may well have been what saved me if I had gotten in trouble. So there's many different levels. As it worked out. It was not as big a deal as the original cry of fire was. The unfortunate part was that the first person who was told about it, instead of calling the fire department, exited the building.
Oh, nice move.
Yeah.
That's
yeah. And it was before a cell phone, so that
I'm getting out of Dodge, thank you.
That was exactly what they did. So, you never know. But it is important to call it on up and let people know.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah. Different folks, different responses, and it's just the way it is. But nobody was hurt in that fire. And it was more annoying and costly, of course, to Goodyear because it shut down production for a while. And other stuff. And then they had to clean up. But nobody was injured in it. It was just one of those annoying things.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Some of the different stuff. So
yeah.
So anyway, back to that, right? So if that had happened, or even whenever it happened, on Rosh Hashanah, we're invited to start the period, which are called the 10 Days of Awe. And that's, on Yom Kippur, we are going to be approaching God, looking for a God experience. And it's the last day to go back and try to balance the book, if you will, for last year.
Now, the Day of Atonement,
Mm-hmm.
do you fast during that day?
Yeah. It's typically a 25 to 26 hour fast.
Okay.
A little bit longer for cantors because it's hard to sing on a full stomach.
I'll bet it is.
So, and even I eat a light meal late in the day. And then I get scurrying with getting ready for the service. And If I'm lucky, I remember to grab one of these guys a bottle of coffee or a cup of coffee. My husband usually tries to throw a cup of coffee at me just to make it easier to get through the fast, so I'm not as uncaffeinated by the end of the day. And that'll be Tuesday evening, the 4th of October, and all day the 5th of October. And it is a day spent entirely in prayer. And it's reminding ourselves over and over and over again that not only do we sin as individuals, and I'll talk about what sin is Jewishly in a moment here, but also we as a community fail to make amends when somebody has done something wrong. And so Judaism says if you're aware that somebody is hurting somebody, you cannot sit idly by and say, well, I'm not involved, I'm going to be neutral. Judaism recognized thousands of years ago that what a bully needs is for people to stand idly by. When you don't respond and there's a bully abusing people, you are as culpable as the bully, says Judaism, if you don't do something to intervene.
Oh.
Yeah. Right. So this fallacy of I'm just being neutral, the fight's between you and somebody else. Well, if that somebody else has undue power in the scenario, or is if somebody's aggressing inappropriately at somebody, then you can't be neutral, because to be neutral is to support that. It's an interesting take. And Yom Kippur says, to the extent that you didn't live up to be your best self, to do what you could do, you are culpable. And what are you going to do for the universe to balance that out? Because don't we want to be balanced, if not tipping to the good, when we come face to face and bare our souls to God? I tell my congregation that there's good news and bad news about Yom Kippur. The good news is that anything for which you are truly repentant and are doing repair, doing tshuva, then you are forgiven. That's what God promises. We actually read the text out of Scripture where God says, I forgive you, because God's very capable of that. The bad news is that you've got to own it and make restitution. So it's not enough to say, oh, I'm sorry. What are you going to do about it?
Okay. Yeah.
Right, so that's restitution. And I know that I've used it before, but the example is if I keep your lawnmower all season and you end up using a lawn service, I need to pay for that lawn service and maybe even take you out to dinner because I kept your lawnmower and you were too nice to ask me for it. But to the extent that you should have asked me for it, maybe you're a little bit culpable. And it gets much more complex and interesting that way. So this is as good a place as any to say to folks, if you haven't found your home for Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, please do consider joining Congregation Eitz Chayim. Services start 7 o'clock Sunday evening, this Sunday, the 25th of September, and they'll continue 10 o'clock Monday morning at Congregation Eitz Chayim. You can register on our website, www.eitzchayim.org, or dash us a note on Facebook. We don't sell tickets, but we do welcome donations. We recognize that people are adults and know that we do have to pay rent, we do have to pay light, all those little things. Congregations have bills.
Which have all doubled, it seems like.
Oh, yeah. Boy, have they. And so we still need help with all of those things, and donations are cheerfully accepted, gratefully accepted.
So how much time is actually spent in the temple on the High Holy Days?
On Rosh Hashanah, it's a couple of hours the evening before and 2 to 3 hours the morning of. And then in the afternoon, we're going to be taking a walk in the park and doing a ritual called Tashlich, which is to send off the things that you still need to work on. Right? You come to Rosh Hashanah and you realize, I'm not ready to let go of this yet. I'm not ready to do the restitution. This is something I need to work on.
Huh. Okay. I've never heard of that.
Yeah,
Okay.
there's a ritual for even for that. So it really is aimed at helping people be the best human beings they can. And we recognize that we're not sinless. So what is sin Jewishly? That's as good a place as any to stick that in. And sin is considered, it's an archery term, interestingly, and it means missing the bullseye. So you may
What?
Yeah. It's missing the bullseye.
Wow, okay.
So you may have thought you were defending yourself. You may have thought you were standing up for something. You may have thought you were complimenting somebody on something, but in fact you ended up hurting somebody. So you don't have to be intentionally hurting somebody. Intentionally hurting somebody is a transgression. It's much bigger than a sin. But even, when you hurt somebody unintentionally, you say something and somebody takes it wrong, you've got a little bit of responsibility there, even if it was them that took it wrong. And it's for you to be aware. So, for example, one of the examples that Shayna Lester in California likes to use, she says, if you're in a room with 20 people and you turn to one of them and say, Sally, I really like that dress that you're wearing or that top or whatever, and you think that what you're doing is being complimentary, and what you don't realize is that Jane worked really hard on her outfit, and now she feels a failure. Now, is that all Jane? Maybe not, because you might have made too much of a fuss over somebody who had more money and could afford fancier clothes. It's just a sensitivity issue.
Okay.
Right?
That never would have crossed my mind.
It's a read the room kind of. If you're going to say something, then you need to be aware that words have unintended consequences.
Yeah.
And they do. And yes, it's hard to keep track of all that. Right? And Scripture again talks about, for example, when the prophet comes to David and says to him, you've done a terrible wrong here. And David says, Chatati v'lo yadati, I sinned and I didn't know it. Right. I didn't realize it. Thank you for bringing it to my attention, because now that you have, I can do something for restitution. I can't undo it because it's in the past, but I can do something moving forward. I can be more sensitive about it in the future, and I can make some restitution. Doesn't mean, you can't necessarily undo the damage. I can't give you back your lawnmower a year ago, but I can make you feel better about the situation. And, help you not carry anger. And that's an interesting piece that people don't always get. Who benefits from forgiveness? Not the object of the forgiveness. Right? You get the benefit of forgiving somebody because you're no longer carrying around that toxin, hoping that it hurts them. When you're angry at somebody and carrying a grudge, that it's been likened to taking poison and hoping the other person suffers. Very often the other person has no clue what you're angry about. And here's the piece. Here's the really hard piece. When you're angry at somebody, it's about control. It's about control. I don't like that when I'm angry. But when I calm down, I have to admit that, anger is about control. It might be about control of myself. Am I controlling myself in a situation? It might be in my inability to convince you that, no, it's not okay to do what you're doing. But, I can only do so much. And, that's that serenity prayer. Right? God, give me and the wisdom to tell the difference between what I can and should control and what I can't. And how do I make others safe if you're behaving in an unsafe way? How do I make you safe if you're behaving in an unsafe way? And so nobody said life was easy, folks. It's not. It's a very complex situation with many layers and many questions, and we still have to act inside all of those questions. Mm-hmm. It's the story of Pinchas, or Phineas, as it's usually rendered, when he takes matters into his own hand and becomes a vigilante. The reason that he's praised for that is because nobody else is doing anything. And even though what he does leads to a war, because it does, it kicks off a war. And that's certainly not good, but on the other hand, it moves the discussion forward.
Okay.
In biblical story fashion.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, are there, like, I remember my 7-foot nuns talking about mortal sins versus venial ones. Are there levels?
Yeah,
of sin?
yeah. There are. It depends on how much damage is done. Yeah, that's the criteria. You know, certainly it's worse to hit 5 people than to hit 1. That's not rocket science. To make somebody feel a little bad versus somebody gets sick. There's grades. It's not a one size fits all. And there's even a discussion about if something is in Torah and it says don't do this, that's stronger than if the rabbis say don't do something. So, for example, the meat and milk dietary rules come out of the rabbis. It doesn't come out of Torah. What Torah says is don't see the kid in its mother's milk. So unless you're running around throwing baby kids into their mother's milk, boiling, you're probably not violating that injunction.
Okay, so that's
a cheeseburger,
human decision.
It's a human decision. It's a human application. And Judaism recognizes that that's a different level. That's people trying to what's called put a fence around it, right? Make it harder. In fact, the rabbis in Talmud talk about that. Why did they institute the meat and milk separation? Because the rabbis overhear some women in the market talking about boiling meat in milk to make it tastier. And they actually become afraid that inadvertently somebody might violate that Torah law. So they say, no more meat and milk. It's a much later thing. It's not an instruction from God.
So you don't look at the fact that the human that God may be speaking through that human decision, if you will.
It's not the same level as what's in Torah. Now, recognize at the same time that the Orthodox will talk about the written Torah, and they'll talk about oral Torah, because oral Torah is the lens through which they look at the written Torah. And it does change things. But even there, they recognize that humans are not perfect speakers for God, by far. And there's an interesting instruction also in Torah. This is, how do you know if a prophet is true? And the answer is it takes time. You've got to see if what they're teaching is true or not. And it's not about whether or not they predict a hurricane's going to hit Tampa or not. It's about, is what they're teaching helping you move forward in life? And that takes time. That takes time.
That could take decades.
Absolutely. So, beware. You may or may not have a true prophet on your hand. And, the penalty for a false prophet, the Torah gives a little bit of a clue. It says if the prophet is taking you away from Torah and tradition, probably not a true one. Shouldn't be taking you elsewhere.
Huh, okay.
Right. So, in other words, a true prophet's one that helps you move toward being a better you. Right?
I get that. Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah. So it's complicated. I guess that's or as I like to say when I teach the unit on Judaism in the world religion section, some do, some don't. Right. And part of that's because Judaism is a seeking religion. Right. We've not found anything. We're coming together as a group to seek a God experience. And that's very different. So I'm not holding something out to you and saying this is God. In fact, if anything, what I'm telling you is this is what God's not. God has no form. God has no shape. God has no this, no that. And what are you left with is just pure essence, the essence of life. And the way that I usually frame that personally is I say that God is the force that causes people to breathe. And I may not know everything there is to know about what that force is, and I don't think anybody does. But clearly, breath is the difference between life and not life.
So now, would Buddhism and Hinduism be seeking religions as well, or no?
Yeah, they're
They
much
are.
more seeking. I think older indigenous religions, and Judaism has a lot of the hallmarks of early indigenousness, for lack of a better word. I think a lot of those are seeking religions. And we can ask the question of, where did Christianity change to become a found religion? And part of the answer probably is Greece and Rome.
Yeah.
Some of that work that Aristotle and Alexander the Great did.
Well, I remember going, it seemed like my roots really started in Tucson, but in talking, having some deep conversations with some Papago leaders, that they really were seeking.
Yeah.
The Indian tribes.
Yeah.
In Arizona
Seeking the
and New
divine
Mexico.
spirit in all
You
things.
bet. Always.
Yeah. And they talk about Father Sky and
Yes.
Mother Earth,
Oh, yeah.
and treating her gently because she's your mother, and she gives food. And, Torah talks about that too, that when you treat the earth well, the rains come in the right season, and the earth gives of her abundance. And if you don't, the rains will stop, and you won't have the food. You won't survive.
The droughts.
Droughts, yeah. And I think that part of the, I talk about this with my students also. For example, rain dances. One of the things that a lot of people associate with Native Americans. Rain dances. Do you think that and Bible has rains too, and so does Talmud, but do you think that people thought that rain dances actually made it rain? Certainly not always. Right, but what happens in a rain dance? Let's think about this a minute, folks. People come to participate in the rain dance, to watch it, to be there, to see if it's going to work. And when you do that, when the community comes together, you get to check on each other. Where's Jane? Is her grandmother here? Excuse me. Right. So, and you can send somebody home with some food if they're really hurting. And if you have extra, you might bring it to this festival to share.
Oh, wow.
So it really is about this community check-in, much more than whether or not it's to make sure you survive as a community until the next rain. Eventually the drought will end. Everybody knows that. Eventually the drought will end. It's not permanent. The key is to survive.
It takes a village.
It takes a village.
What a novel concept.
And so the rain dance, while beautiful, and yes, it's an appeal to God and the spirits to make it rain, but it's also a chance to look around, for the leadership to look around and see who needs help.
That's intriguing.
And who
that
to-
is really intriguing.
And who, if you think about it, it makes complete sense, though, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Right. And so that's true about many rituals. They might be ostensibly about this or that, but it's also a check-in. It's a check-in function. When you have the big gatherings, they're check-ins. And the same is true in Judaism. When you've got, the Shabbat is a weekly check-in with everybody to see how everybody's doing. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, the big check-ins. Rosh Hashanah, how are you doing? How's it going? And by Yom Kippur, hopefully you've evened things out a little bit and you've made some restitution. It just makes complete sense. It's not anything super weird or hard. And there was a beautiful piece put out, and I apologize to the rabbi, I don't remember the name, But all I remember was a woman, and it was a male friend who posted and commented about it. But the comment was, if you're coming into Rosh Hashanah and you think that there's no big deal going on, then you're not listening to the shofar. Because the shofar that I sounded a few weeks ago is about wakening your soul to the realities. None of us is perfect. We've all made tons of mistakes because we're perfectly human. And we're expected to make mistakes. We're not expected to be some divine being. We're not angels, nor are we designed to be angels. And so that's the good and bad news. It means I can get better. I'm not stuck. I can get better. Even if only a little. And if I can do it one day a year, I can do it a whole bunch more. And I'm not going to say 365 because that's a solar year. I always get a kick out of that. Right? The people who say, I wish you 365 days. Well, thank you for wishing me a solar year. But Jewishly, we're on a lunar year. And it's short or long, and it's almost never 365 days. Because Judaism balances it out over a 17-year period.
Oh, gosh.
So, yeah. I'd have to look up the text and see how many days each year was. And part of that's because some lunar months are 29 days and some are 30 days, because the Earth is just not perfect. I'm sorry. It's perfectly Earth, but it's not.
So who came up with that 17-day or 17-year revision
cycle?
On that?
It was the organic. Somebody realized the pattern. It's often credited to a rabbi named Samuel, who didn't have a last name, because it was common not to have last names in those days.
Kind of like a rock star.
Well, he was a math star.
Math star.
Right. A math lead, or whatever they call those folks that are really good at math. And he saw the pattern. In the old days, the Sanhedrin, the judges, would sit and wait for witnesses to say it was the new moon. Of course, they knew it was either tonight or tomorrow night, and they were pretty sure. They got the pattern after a while. But two people unrelated, who had to be interrogated to see if they were reliable witnesses, would run to the Sanhedrin and say, I saw the new moon, and it looked like this, and it was in this part of the sky, and it had this shape and that shape, and they could figure out if it was real or not by what somebody was saying. And then the word would go out that it was the new moon. And they would figure out when it was a leap year by how short the year had been, and whether or not the barley was sprouting in Jerusalem. If the wild barley was sprouting, then it was not a leap year. And so it stayed locked it's called intercalated to the solar calendar, because farmers need the solar calendar. Baby lambs are born according to the solar calendar, and crops grow according to the solar calendar. But before we had things like cell phones and cameras and what have you, we would have to look at the moon to figure out what time it was. Everybody can see the moon. Everybody knows when the moon is full and when it's waning and when it's waxing. It's particularly easy when we didn't have electricity. It's really hard to understand the difference in our lives now versus 100 or 200 years ago. The changes, the technological advances, the phone, and Cliff mentioned it on Swap Shop, right? The difference in having a watch or not having a watch. Most people, you're not wearing a watch, I'm not wearing a watch, because we've got so many things around us that tell us the time. Watches were a great invention in their day. Yeah, the cell phone.
I'm carrying my watch.
Yeah, which is what most people are. And that's what, when I want to know what time it is, I tap my phone. And my students get a kick out of it, because the first thing I do is tap the phone and look at the clock in the room and figure out what the offset is, because somehow they're always a couple minutes fast. I'm not quite sure. I have a feeling that has to do with getting out. But
the student's setting him.
That's my theory. I've never caught him, but that's my theory. And right, so Yeah.
I should have thought of that. Now, that would have been me.
Getting up there, climbing up.
Getting up and climbing
Yeah.
and speeding up the clock.
But it's worth noting, right? How does your cell phone know what time it is? Because it queries the satellite, which gets its time from the world clock. Which, folks, the world clock, you can Google it. It's in Boulder, Colorado.
Yep.
Which means there wasn't a world clock before there was a Boulder, Colorado. This is recent.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, and the world clock is in an earthquake nuclear safe vault so that it keeps ticking. Which means that we didn't have that concept until the world clock. Hello? Right? When time was told on a sundial, there were 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night. So in the summer, the day hours were longer and the night hours were shorter. And the opposite was true in winter, at least in the northern hemisphere. Opposite, obviously, in the southern hemisphere. But apparently trade didn't go far enough to really pick that up. And just as the days here and in Tucson and lower California, because California is so big, and in Israel and a big chunk of that part of the world is on the same latitude. So days and nights are almost the same, winter and summer. There's some difference.
There's a little difference.
But not like there is up in Ohio or Canada or Alaska. Certainly not where they have 12-hour days and 12-hour nights. I'm not sure how biblically they would handle that. But it certainly makes the sundown Sabbath much tougher.
That would be fascinating to talk to some of the Aleutian Indians.
Yeah. And their rituals, I'm sure, are different because of the midnight sun and the days of darkness. Because life is different when it's that. And they don't get enough vitamin D anyway. Right. We get an abundance here, and for us to just take a walk outside is to get some vitamin D. But not true. Which reminds me, I didn't take my vitamin supplements this morning, so... You know.
Well, and I remember one time my crew and I were flying up from L.A., and we landed in Seattle, and the head of the soccer team up there said, well, thank goodness you guys from L.A. are here. This is the first time we've seen the sun in 55 days. And it's like, oh, my. Yeah.
So the world is an interesting place. It really is.
And it's different.
And the ancients didn't know from all this. So, and you might say, well, God said, and true, but God would have to say it in words that they understood, using images and parables that they would understand, or it wouldn't have worked. And so we are locked into the time, the place, and the culture where the words are written. And that's just being intelligent about them. God doesn't intend for life to freeze ever, or we wouldn't have genetics the way it operates. We wouldn't have genetics. When the mom and dad, taking dad as the entity that produces sperm and mom as the entity that creates an egg, when those two gametes reach, when they meet and fertilize the egg, the cell goes through an interesting piece called meiosis and mitosis. It separates, and it also does this wild spin-off and recombination of the genetic material so that there's a randomness to it. And you may end up with 48% from one parent and 52% from the other because of this wild swap 'em, change 'em, break off, recombine. And it's nature's way of helping us adjust over time. And the healthier, stronger, more viable recombinations over time by great numbers are the ones that change. And so people become taller, shorter, more resistant to that, more susceptible to this. All of that keeps changing, and the world changes around us. Viruses mutate, we know that. And so our body has to adjust to learn how to fend that off. And that's just part of the natural adjustment of how things work. And, I look at you here with, brownish hair with whatever gray I've got in it and blue eyes. And I'm pretty sure that if I go all the way back, they were brown until somebody came up with blue eyes along the way. And I don't know who married who or who did what, but somehow my father had blue eyes and so do I. And, yeah.
Sure.
And they're a light blue.
Now, was your dad short or tall?
My dad was very short. He was 5'4".
Oh, okay.
Okay, and my mother was 5 foot nothing. When she was tall. As she got older, it was well under that. Mm-hmm. And I have the identical body shape. Thank you, Mom and Grandma.
Yeah?
Yeah, I used to listen to her about how she struggled, and I totally get it. Thank you for those genes. On the other hand, I'll take the genes. My mother's family, thank God, lived well into their 90s, and I'm hopeful that I will do the same.
Yeah, well, there you
Hopefully
go.
I'll take care enough of myself. I'm doing a couple of things better than my mom and grandmother did. I'm eating healthier. I know that I am. So this is as good I've got 2 minutes left. I see that on the clock. 2 things. One, if you'd like to sponsor an episode of Ask a Rabbi in our new time slot of 10:05, then please feel free to contact me or contact the station, and the station number is 772-340-1590. And hopefully next week we'll get some calls in. But please feel free for that. And I also invite people to take a look on Amazon for Inspired by Zentangle Art 1, my new Zentangle-inspired meditation coloring book.
Ooh, very cool.
So, appreciate that. So I hope everyone has a wonderful transition into 5783, as the rabbis counted it, not God. And may you have a joyous, sweet, and happy New Year. This is Rabbi Shafir Loeb for Congregation Eitz Chayim. Please join us for the High Holy Day celebrations. Also streaming on Facebook. Good day, everyone.
You've been listening to Ask a Rabbi right here on WPSL, Port St. Lucie.